presentation is How Long Would It Take for Him to Be Booed Off the Stage? Examining the Role of Heterosexual White Men in Movements Towards Racial and Gender Equality. So big title. This is a part of like a larger research project that I did while I was abroad in Cape Town in South Africa last semester. So like the whole research project ended up being like this like pretty big paper, hence like the huge title.
I'm so sorry.
No, don't worry. What is it? Thank you. So this is a part of like my larger research paper. I'm doing my best to like condense it, but there was like a lot of like background research. So basically like my motivation for studying this, I know like the last thing we need is like more academia focused on like straight white men. But my original like thing that I wanted to do was study the HIV and AIDS epidemic, which is like South Africa is like the country with like the largest epidemic of HIV and AIDS worldwide right now. And Cape Town specifically is like the biggest like city in South Africa that like has just like a huge epidemic. So I kind of wanted to study that. I wanted to figure it out, see what was going on. And basically what's happening in South Africa right now is that like the conversation around HIV and AIDS is like the first time that they're including men in the conversation about gender equality. What they're understanding is like because it's spread like via like heterosexual sex a lot of the time in South Africa, like obviously like men need to be included in that conversation. But what I started to find was that like a lot of the conversation and the discourse that's been created like worldwide about HIV and AIDS like focuses on the demonization of black men and the victimization of white women. So what I was trying to figure out was like, where do white men have a role here? Like, are they being addressed in the conversation about gender equality, especially understanding that like due to the history of South Africa and like the history of like whiteness and masculinity worldwide, like white men have a lot of power. So I was trying to figure out like where that power lied. So I was trying to figure out where they fell in the epidemic. I started my research and basically found that like the white men that I was interviewing had like 3 seconds of conversation on the HIV and AIDS epidemic. They were like, yeah, I've heard about it, like I'm taught about it in sex ed, and like that's about it. And like there wasn't much for me to write like a thesis on. So I continued my research to try to figure out like why white men like weren't being included in this conversation and like what they felt as if like their role in terms of like gender and racial equality was. So trying to go a little bit deeper into that. So this is a quote that like kind of was like driving my research, was like finding a way to like undermine the more impressive aspects of society rather than just focusing on like women and people of color to like even up the score with like white men. So just like a little bit of background, like the context like very roughly is like whiteness in South Africa. There's been a history of slavery, colonialism, and apartheid. So apartheid, like if you guys haven't heard of it, like it's defined as a crime against humanity by the UN. It was basically like very, very strict segregation that rested on, I'll read a quote, assumptions of racial and cultural superiority, of entitlement and political control and land ownership, and of the right to benefit from their access to the world capitalist system at the expense of an exploited, subjugated, non-white majority. So it's violent, it's dehumanizing, it was heavily enforced. It essentially made like people of color like not citizens in South Africa. Like white people were owning like 85% of the land, even though they were only 13% of the population. So in 1984, I'm sure most of you have heard of Nelson Mandela. Like there was like South Africa became a democracy, like it was finally free. There was this idea of like the Rainbow Nation that was promoted all over, and people were like, yeah, awesome, like everything's finally equal, like we can move on from apartheid. And like you can understand the ways in which like that is an idea promoted by white people, that like we could just move on from segregation. We see the same thing in America, where like with the end of like the civil rights movement, it's like promoted that there's equality, even though we can still see the ways that like informal segregation is like still very much alive. So I put in a couple quotes about like this idea of like the Rainbow Nation, that was like the free and multicultural South Africa. So the way in which like it's not a reality for a lot of people of color. There's been an MTV documentary, The People versus the Rainbow Nation. There's also The People versus the Patriarchy. Both are like absolutely awesome. And basically saying that like the Rainbow Nation is like a myth, it's like a political scandal, all of that kind of stuff. And like obviously you can see how like there's still this idea of like white entitlement, white supremacy, the same thing we can say for America. So even though I did my research in South Africa, I think it has like very real effects because of the legacy of slavery, colonialism, and segregation that you can see in America as well. So I was relating this to masculinity as well. and like the idea of hegemonic white masculinity. So kind of like a step different than toxic masculinity, but like understanding that like there's a racialized hierarchy of masculinities. So if we understand that like gender is a social construct and like masculinity and femininity are both social constructs, we're going to refer to them in the plural as masculinities, understanding that like it's a social construction more so than just gender. It's impacted by race, by ability, by really any other aspect of identity. So white masculinity became hegemonic because if we look at like the racialized history and like the very racist history of like South Africa, America as well, there was this destruction of black masculinity and really like the humanity of people of color in lieu of like this like white patriarchal norm. So yeah, that's basically that. So it became dominant, became normative, it became like the standard that we were judging all things by, and that's still true today. So hegemonic white masculinity is characterized by assertive heterosexuality, control of economic decisions within and outside the home, political authority, cultural ascendancy, and support for male promiscuity. So that's why I focused my research on heterosexual white masculinity, because I was trying to look at this idea of hegemonic white masculinity. We all have like stereotypes about toxic masculinity. I wanted to see how true those were, like how people were reacting, like kind of in defense of that. And yeah, trying to figure that out. So what's happening in South Africa right now, where there's a lot of academic research focused, is on this crisis of white masculinity. So I'm sure you've all heard of like white victimization, male victimization. I'll get more into that later. But there was this like crisis of white masculinity that happened with the end of apartheid. So there are a couple examples in here. There were both the Employment Equity Act and the Black Economic Empowerment Acts. Both of those are like kind of like affirmative action, just like finding ways to like promote like the education of like people of color and also like their economic opportunities, understanding that like under apartheid like they weren't really like granted an education that was like equal. You could see like the parallels to American segregation as well, and just finding ways to like promote equal employment. So because of that, there's like a lot of narratives of like a crisis of white masculinity where like as a white man it's really hard to get a job, it's really hard to get an education. These are a lot of the narratives I was hearing. Then there are a lot of movements. My research was conducted at the University of Cape Town, so there were a lot of movements on that campus as a whole. That campus like has historically been very white. Now it's still 40% white, even though white people are only 10% of the population in South Africa. So there are a lot of movements about like men are trash happening, trying to like end rape culture on campus, a decolonization of academia as well. So saying that like if you call a class like intro to philosophy, it's really intro to Western philosophy, and like the ways in which like Westernization is promoted as like normative. And then there's a huge movement called Disrupt Whiteness. And I guess like you can like roughly compare that to like the same idea of like Get Woke Nova on this campus. So saying that like even if you're not intentionally racist, like there are ways that you contribute to a culture of like white supremacy on campus. So there have been a ton of huge student movements, two of which were like Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall. Rhodes Must Fall was trying to remove a statue of Cecil Rhodes, who was like a Dutch colonizer, and there's a giant statue of him on campus, so they were trying to get rid of that statue. They got rid of it in 2016, so still like 22 years post-apartheid. And then also Fees Must Fall, which was saying that student fees, so tuition, were like way too high, and like the only people that were able to afford it were like white people. And the student fees still haven't changed. That movement was in 2017. Nothing has changed since, but like the movement's still pretty prevalent. So yeah, just to preface this research, I only researched 7 students at the University of Cape Town. I conducted this research over 4 weeks, so like it's qualitative research. Like you can't really make like sweeping like assumptions about like all white men because of this. But these were just some trends and like some narratives that I had heard and I think like can relate more broadly, like obviously continuing academic research on this. I used Tinder to find people to interview because I didn't know any white South African men. So I like went on Tinder, said I was there for a research project, met some people. So I really didn't have any like qualifiers other than they had to be straight white men. So I ended up interviewing like a couple, the majority of my interviewees were moderate, a couple very liberal men who had like studied a lot of gender, and a couple conservative white men. One of them was like adamantly in a white supremacist organization, so like a couple of the more extreme quotes that you're going to see in here were like definitely from him, but I will preface that as well. in terms of my positionality, like I just have to recognize that in research because I was conducting in-person interviews with my participants. Because I am also white, I felt as if my participants were very quick to talk about gender and defend their gender to me more so than address our like common experience of whiteness. And also because of just like the way in which I have also been socialized to believe that like whiteness is like normative, and like the way in which we see that like in our education system, like I am very hypercritical of comments about gender more so than I'm able to pick up comments about race. So it's something I was really working on in this project, but it's just like something that we need to preface, like the way in which my positionality as a white woman like impacts the research. But it was a very interesting research project because I felt as if I was able to kind of understand like white womanhood as well, and like the narrative that's like been critiqued more and more about white women in the way that like I as a white woman am like can say that like I've experienced oppression and like grouping oppression into like this very vague category. So that was an interesting part of this research as well. Okay, so I had kind of started my research. I just wanted to give a summary of like what I was getting from my participants. I asked them what they felt as if the role of white heterosexual men was in terms of gender and racial equality. And they were kind of like, well, we can't really do much until like we change the way like children are taught in schools, the way in which they're socialized, like the way we teach about race, the way we teach about gender. So that was like kind of an inactive approach. And their other thing was that they wanted to learn how to stop talking and taking up so much space and start listening to like marginalized identities and hearing like their experiences. So something I kind of noticed from that was that like there weren't very many active steps that you could take. And you also have to understand like white men in South Africa and in America just have like these like huge positions of power. Like because apartheid ended like 20-something years ago, like the people that are running companies, the people that are like receiving college educations, like the majority of like older people in South Africa with educations are like white men. So like they have a ton of power, they have a ton of economic control, but like weren't really doing much actively with it. So I was trying to figure that out and see where to go from there. So now I'm kind of get into like my research findings. So the first trend I noticed was this trend of white male victimization. So a quote from one of my participants is that right now there's a lot more stigma surrounding a white male than there was 20 years ago. So that's where the quote from the like beginning of my presentation comes from. Like the quote, how long would it take for him to get booed off the stage, was one of my participants talking about what would happen if he were to go to like a women's march. And he was like, do you understand that like people don't think that white men can be a part of these like social justice movements? He was saying that like if a white man were to go and like speak on stage at a women's march, like he would get booed off the stage. So they were like, it's really frustrating that like people assume that because I'm a white male that like I'm racist and I'm sexist. There was this like feeling of offense and disgust that was coming up a lot. They were really upset that like people weren't more understanding to them, like weren't accommodating their feelings. So yeah, these are a couple of my findings. I'll get more into what they mean later. There were also claims of reverse discrimination. So one of my more conservative participants had called what was happening now with like the affirmative action, he called it apartheid in reverse. So you can understand, like, he was likening, like, his perceived crisis of white masculinity to, like, a crime against humanity. And also, like, a lot of my participants were saying that right now for them it's less free than it used to be, which, like, valid, because you can understand how, like, without formal segregation, it's, like, white people have less than they had before. But, like, there were some problems lying below that research as well. So kind of like how I had interpreted this was like white men are receiving less than what their socialization believes, like leads them to believe that they are worthy of. So a lot of this like feeling of entitlement comes from the fact that like white people are still taught that like they are entitled to like things in society, that they're entitled to a good education, they're entitled to like good employment, they're entitled to a very specific kind of income. And like when they're met with something that they perceive as like more unequal, like that's where all these thoughts come from. So what they're ignoring is the reality that like what means less for white men is still going to be more than women and people of color. And what they think is like if they are victims of anti-racism and anti-sexism efforts, such as like affirmative action and like efforts to like disrupt whiteness and like end rape culture on campus, they believe that they can't be the beneficiaries of privilege. So it's like this very binary way of thinking. And what that does is it redirects the conversation about equality towards like a mixture of blame and defense. It's like, who is responsible for this? Who needs to like clean up the mess? And it's like, we as like white people don't need to clean up the mess because like affirmative action is happening. So it's like all of these narratives that are actually just like avoiding anyone taking responsibility over fixing any kinds of issues of like whiteness or patriarchy. And also, like, we can understand how, like, feelings of offense and disgust, whether from white people or whether from men, are just really taking up space from people of color and women. If we understand that, like, white people and men have larger voices, then, like, white men are, like, listened to more, and, like, it's their feelings of offense and disgust that are, like, taking over these conversations about, like, race and gender. I was in a lecture at, like, while I was studying, and I was with a group of just Americans, and, like, the conversation turned very quickly as to like how we as like the white people in the program were like committing like microaggressive acts and like just like being like very like both implicitly and explicitly racist. And someone had made a comment about like, isn't it so interesting how white people always take over the conversation about race? And that comes from like a lot of how like psychologically like this is like a big adjustment, which doesn't validate the fact that like so much space is being taken up. Another trend I noticed, especially among my more liberal participants, was recognition of their positionality. So most of my participants had not thought about their privilege and power until they got to university. So a critique of that is that like university is not always going to be very accessible for people. Like not everyone goes to university. Like there are a lot of like other careers that you can get like without going to college, and just like the financial barriers that are in place in order to get to college. Like that's a very inaccessible way of thinking about power and privilege, especially because the ways in which they experience power and privilege were through like classes about the social sciences and humanities. And like UCT is like very similar to Villanova in the way that like a lot of students are business majors and a lot of students are engineers. There are not a ton of like men in social sciences and humanities, and just like not a ton of people in social sciences and humanities either. So like if you're only getting that through those specific classes, you have to think about like the very limited proportion of that population that is like receiving that education. Especially that it's like what's known as like the born freeze. So like people born after 1994 were born in an era without apartheid. So like the older people in society are like still not receiving this kind of education about like power and privilege. So also like call-out culture, there were a lot of thoughts on that. A lot of people were saying that the only way in which they learned about their positionality was through like getting called out for like racist or sexist comments that they've made. And so there's like two things that come with that, is like where does the burden of that call-out come from? I had one of my participants telling me that like he was out at a bar with like some of his friends, and like his friend was trying to make him take a tequila shot and he didn't really want to, so he turned to his friend and he was like, "Don't be such a bitch." And there was like one girl in their group of like 10 men, and he was like, "She went off on me, like it was so bad, like I realized I shouldn't have said it if she was there." And so I kind of like unpacked that with him a little bit further, and I was like, would there have been an issue with what you said if she wasn't there? And he was like, "No, absolutely not, like none of my friends would have called me out on it, and like it wouldn't have been a problem." So we can see how like the burden of the call culture still falls upon the people who are like victimized by those phrases. So there wasn't a lot of accountability being held like in groups of men or in groups of like white people. And also like another part of that was that he recognized the fault to be like not with the comment that he said, but with her reaction to it. He was like, "I should have known she's the kind of person that would freak out about that," rather than just like understanding that like that was like a problematic thing for him to say. So kind of unpacking that a little bit further. So the initial feelings surrounding positionality are confusion and defensiveness because of how deeply normalized whiteness and like masculinity are. So like if you're not being told things about your like the fact that you have privilege, the fact that you have power until you're like 20-something years old and you're in a college class, like your first reaction, and I'm sure like any like men or any white people in the room like can probably relate to this because I know I can too. Like when you're called out about something, you immediately get defensive. You're like, "That's not what I meant." And that like invalidates the way in which someone took the comment that you made. So there's like this initial defensiveness, and there's like this wall that comes up because you don't want to hear that like you've contributed to like a racist or sexist environment. My participants were focusing more on trying to like understand the existence of racism and sexism rather than attempting to mitigate its effects. like hearing that racism and sexism were still alive in South Africa was like something that felt very new to them. And I'm sure that like has felt very new to like again, like any like white people or like men in the room. So like a lot of like the coming up like academia around whiteness is like trying to understand the fact that like whiteness exists and understanding like what does white privilege mean, rather than like trying to understand how to wield that privilege in a way that like mitigates its effects and like makes you like a less colonizing part of like society. So because of that, like what I also experienced were my participants telling me that like they're very sympathetic to racist or sexist comments that are made by their friends. They were like, if I think about it, like I can definitely pick up on what they're saying, but like I'm not going to call them out because I understand that it took me a really long time to get to this point. And they were like, I'm not going to call out my friends because like I would have made that same mistake in the past. I would have gotten defensive. Like they're not going to learn anything from it. So it's kind of like protecting whiteness and protecting masculinity. So because of that, like because I'm like my participants were saying that like they as like white men were not holding their other like white male friends accountable, the burden still falls on women and people of color to fix the very system that victimizes them, and like to validate their feelings and then like be met with like initial defensiveness. And that was something that came up a lot with like the Americans on my program as well. There were a couple times that like Black Americans on our program had like called out like a couple comments that like we the white people made on the trip, and we were like, no, you don't understand, like our intentions were good, this is what we intended, and like that's like completely invalidating to those feelings and like the way in which it was received. So that was a big thing of what I found. Another trend that I noticed, I know you can like see kind of like the two trends, like I talked about white male victimization and I talked about recognition of positionality, and like in our minds we can kind of separate that into something that's very conservative and something that's very liberal. It's like two very different things. But something I found among all 7 of my participants was a separation from the idea of stereotypical masculinity. So their conversation to me, and maybe this is because I was a woman, but it was focused on personal defenses. They were comparing their progress to more conservative men. So like about 45 minutes from Cape Town is this is Stellenbosch University, which is like a very, very conservative college campus. And they were saying that like, yeah, I understand that like the University of Cape Town is still pretty conservative, but like we're not as bad as like the people that go to Stellenbosch. Like even the fact that I chose to go to UCT rather than Stellenbosch like means that like I'm progressive a little bit. They pointed out that like if I asked them like how they felt as if their masculinity impacted others, a lot of times they would say like I can't really think of any times, like I've never catcalled anyone and like I've never sexually assaulted or raped anyone. So like there's this huge focus on the extremes. They would stress that they were comfortable with their own emotions, thereby like separating them from this idea of like toxic masculinity. 2 of my participants, and this was really interesting, would refer to other white men when he'd talk about them, he would say they. He was like, yeah, like they do this, like they experience this, and like not really understanding how like he is also perceived in that same way and like has contributed to those same environments. And one of my participants, one of my more liberal participants, he is cisgender, identifies as a man, but when he's asked to fill out like surveys or like any kind of like application, he'll check other for his gender, because he doesn't want to align himself with like what being a stereotypical man is. So like I don't know if I have to like address the problems in that, but just like there was like no assumption over like his own identity, and then also like taking over the identity of like people who may not, like people who identify as other. So this is what I really found to be like one of the most interesting points of like this entire project, because a lot of this was motivated by like what do we do with like these stereotypes of like toxic masculinity. So I was finding that my participants were individually distancing themselves from masculinity. This is a larger phenomenon. I talked a lot in my paper about this movement like #MenAreTrash that was like trending on Twitter for a while. And then obviously like #Black Lives Matter, like both of those were like huge movements. And I know like a lot of the responses to that are like not all men are trash and all lives matter. So I was kind of connecting this to like this bigger phenomenon of like just like being defensive and like not understanding the roots behind the movement. So the focus that I experienced from my participants is that the focus was on their reputation. They wanted to be a good white man. They wanted to be like a good white liberal. And like we see that as well, rather than understanding the underlying motivation for the movement. So in like a lot of the Twitter hashtags, they were like, yes, like men are trash, but like not all men are trash. Like not all men are rapists. Comments like this. And like that kind of focuses on the extreme and doesn't understand like the way in which the movement is happening. So like the disrupting whiteness movement on campus, on UCT, like speaks a lot about like even if you're not explicitly racist, you are still contributing to this like white supremacist environment that's occurring on campus. So that's kind of gets ignored there. And because of that, there's a failure to assume responsibility for white supremacy and the patriarchy. And it's kind of like the burden falls on women and people of color to not only like call out, as I said before, but also to justify any kind of experience of whiteness or masculinity that they feel. And so what's kind of happening now is that like I experienced a lot of my participants were trying to separate themselves from like the stereotypical white masculinity rather than working on like reconstructing what that means and like how you can mitigate that privilege and power within society. So basically to summarize it, my participants were saying like in terms of like their role in gender and racial equality, they couldn't understand why they weren't welcome in movements. Again, that goes back to the quote of like being booed off the stage. There were a couple like more explicit quotes that I chose like not to include in this presentation. But like they couldn't understand why like so many times they tried to join Rhodes Must Fall, Fees Must Fall, they tried to join the Disrupting Whiteness movement, and they were like immediately told like, we don't need you here, this is our movement. And they couldn't really understand because they were like, I'm trying to be an ally, like I'm trying to be helpful, I'm trying to like mitigate my privilege now that I recognize it, but like couldn't understand why they weren't asked to be a part of those movements. They also were speaking a lot about how they would prefer it if change had slowed down, because like they were saying like we're experiencing such a huge psychological adjustment in like what it means to be like either white or being a man. And they were like, if change just like slowed down, like people aren't appreciating that like a lot has been happening in like the past like 24 years, 25 now. They couldn't understand why like people weren't really happy that like at least some progress has been made in the past 25 years. So that kind of speaks to the fact that like their standards for change are different, obviously. Like they're not trying to like break out of like this like inferiority that like they were socialized to like be under during apartheid. They had like less urgent need for change. So because of that, they were trying to like slow down the movements, and like you can kind of understand like why they're asked not to be a part of those movements if like their standards are different and they're just gonna say like, hey, slow down, like we're moving pretty quickly anyway. There's like much less urgency there, and like their expectations are lower as well. So my two kind of like just biggest like takeaways from this, and like I spoke a lot about like my conclusions in this project, was the danger of homogeneous social circles. So most of my participants were saying that their friends are other white men. Because of that, like they hadn't experienced many call-outs. And I asked them like why they felt as if most of their friends were other white men. They spoke a lot about saying, oh, like it's really familiar, it's really comfortable, like they speak the same language as me. South Africa has 11 official languages, so only like 5% of South Africans grow up like with English as their first language. But schools are taught in English, and everyone learns English in schools, but everyone has a very different home language. So among white South Africans, it would either be English or Afrikaans as like their two like home languages. And there are 9 other like Black African languages that exist in South Africa. So they were saying like, well, obviously like because of language, like it's just like much more comfortable for me to communicate in my home language, which is only shared by other white people. They were saying the geographic location, that they came to school from like these high schools, and like from their high school came like a ton of people with them. So they were really just staying with the people that they had known in high school. So you could see how that contributes to a colorblind mentality, because like they're contributing like these feelings to be as a result of like familiarity and like comfort, rather than as like the fact that like people of color like may not want to be friends with them because of like the microaggressions that are committed. And also like they ignore why that like familiarity and that comfort exists. A lot of times it's because of the segregation that has historically existed in South Africa, and like we see that in a lot of America too. Like neighborhoods are very white because of like the taxes that are required there, because of like historical like laws surrounding like urbanization, and just like the access to the city that people are able to have, and like ownership over that city. So because of that, most of my participants were from private all-male schools. So the all-male schools is like why their friends are mainly men. But also like, because their tuition in high school was so high, like most of their school was just like a school full of like white men. And like we see that with like single gender schools in America as well. And really like with public high schools as well. Like New York City, which like, that's where I'm from, but like New York City, which like we celebrate as this like really multicultural city, is actually one of the most segregated school systems in America. And that's because of just like income inequality and like inequality between neighborhoods. So by adopting this like colorblind mentality, they're ignoring why those they're ignoring the fact that those inequalities still do exist. And then existing in these like homogenous spaces where like there's no diversity. Like if we're understanding that like the burden of call-out culture has historically fell on like women and people of color, like that's why white men aren't getting called out, because they're just like existing in these very comfortable spaces where like no one is personally offended and like no one is going to call them out on that, as I spoke about before. And again, their narratives are then focused on similar experiences, and that's kind of where we see the like whole narrative about white male victimization. I spoke to someone kind of just like to get some direction on this project. He was in charge of a men's support group in Cape Town. So he was like 60 years old. He was like in charge of this group. And what they were doing was kind of like trying to figure out like masculinity without like putting that burden on women. So it was a men's group. And within the past couple of months, they actually, like right before I met with him, they had separated the group racially. So like he was white. So he was in charge of this white men's circle, because they were like, we need to go a step farther than just masculinity. We need to understand the ways in which masculinities are racialized. And like we as white men need to take responsibility for this. But how he was talking to me was like something very unexpected, was like the narratives that were being circled a lot were like these shared experiences of white male victimization. Because like they felt as if they could be much more comfortable in that space. Because of that, they were saying like, wow, it's been really hard to like get a promotion at work. It's been really hard to get hired because of these like Black economic empowerment acts that are in place and like all this affirmative action, and like the narratives go from there. But like that was circling, and there was like no one was keeping that in check. So basically, like then what happens is you get to university and you have a little bit of an exposure to diversity, and that becomes an experience of unlearning and like trying to understand, rather than like understanding like how to mitigate your power. So like that's the point that like most of my participants were at. We're like trying to understand like what exactly it meant to be like a white man in like South Africa today, rather than like how to be a white man and engage in these like movements towards racial and gender equality. And so it all kind of came down to this question of like, what is allyship? And that's kind of where I started too. But how my participants were speaking is that their allyship often follows a model set by people of color and women. So in their eyes, like the only way you can be an ally and the only way you can be a part of a social justice movement is if you're engaging in the movements that already exist. So they're like, okay, cool, like disrupting whiteness exists, like let me go join that group. They were like, roads must fall, fees must fall, like let me go be a part of that group, even though it was a cause that they weren't necessarily like standing behind. For like fees must fall, like obviously it helps everyone when like college tuition is like lower, but like they were engaging in these movements without like feeling like the as urgent need. Like it wasn't like, oh, like if I'm not a part of this movement, I'm gonna have to drop out next semester. And that was what was experienced by like a lot of like people of color at UCT, and like that's why the movement was so urgent. But instead they were just like trying to engage, and like a lot of times they were showing up to movements. Two of my participants spoke about this. They went to like meetings for the movements, and they were like, I was there to learn, like I was asking like to be taught, and he was like really confused why no one would take the time to like educate him. And like I had to like kind of unpack that with him further. Like he was entering the movement when it was like 3 months in, like they were about to have like this huge protest on campus, and like no one really had the time to like sit there and like teach him, and like nor did they have the responsibility to. There was just like no kind of like self-starting for like getting that education. So like you can see who holds the burden of that movement, and also they didn't understand how like them existing in that space can be very colonizing. So I don't know if anyone here has ever read Steve Biko. He was the founder of the Black Consciousness movement. So basically he has this huge chapter on like white liberalism. He wrote it in the 70s, like during apartheid. He was assassinated like by the apartheid government as well. And he was saying that like the issue with having multiracial spaces in terms of like getting towards social justice is that like there is this like superiority, inferiority that exists within multiracial spaces. And that goes back to what I said before about how like white people keep taking over the conversation about race. So Steve Biko was saying that, like, Black people are never going to lead the movement if, like, white people are in that space, because, like, white people have a louder voice. They, like, have more feelings. Like, they're having this huge psychological adjustment, and because, like, apartheid and segregation and the history of slavery and colonialism have, like, socialized Black people to believe that they are inferior, like, they don't have that same voice to, like, kind of, like, take over white people. So there was, like, this, like, lack of understanding how, like, just being a white liberal, like, might not be enough. And the focus then fell, like, for allyship to, like, the individual's reputation. A lot of, like, demonization of conservatives, like, we obviously see that among, like, I know I'm, like, super guilty of that as, like, a white liberal in America, and, like, we see that, like, just, like, politically as, like, this demonization of conservatives, rather than, like, me as, like, a white liberal, like, trying to, like, educate white conservatives. So, like, my final conclusion of this project was that, like, white people and men need to assume accountability over the daily impact of whiteness, male privilege, and their own defensiveness without colonizing the spaces of women and people of color. So, like, it had really never entered into, like, the heads of my participants that, like, their responsibility might not be to, like, join in with movements that are already happening, but to, like, foster accountability and to foster allyship, like, within their, like, white male circles. Because, like, if we understand that, like, most of your exposure is going to be to, like, white men anyway, and, like, a couple of my participants had spoken about how, like, they were seeking out friends of color, especially, like, Black friends more specifically, just because of, like, the dynamics of, like, South Africa as a whole, because they felt very guilty that, like, all of their circles were, like, other white men. So, like, you can see how a lot of that's motivated by white guilt as well. But, like, they just, like, really couldn't conceptualize that, like, their burden might fall to just, like, educating other white men, like, especially understanding that, like, not everyone has the, like, the experience in university of, like, learning about their power and positionality, but, like, refusing to, like, educate and, like, spread that knowledge and, like, have other conversations about, like, whiteness with other white people. And, like, what that turned to was, like, a demonization of, like, other men and other white people for, like, not being on the same playing field as them, which is really interesting because, like, it was, like, within the past couple of months that, like, most of my participants who were freshmen and sophomores in college, like, at university there's 3 years, but most of them who were in their first and second year of university, like, had just learned about their privilege, and a lot of times were like, oh my god, I can't believe, like, they don't know, like, how problematic they're being as white people. So it's, like, this, like, kind of, like, white savior mentality as well. But yeah, I'm sorry, that was, like, a little discombobulated. Like, this was, like, as I said, it was, like, a 60-page project, so, like, it's hard to, like, condense and, like, try to, like, work through everything that I had found. And again, like, it's only from, like, 7 participants, so, like, I'm trying not to make, like, sweeping generalizations about, like, white men as a whole. And this is, like, towards the end of my presentation, but what I found really interesting about this was, like, understanding how, like, gender plays a role in whiteness as well. One of my friends had done a project on white liberalism, and, like, a lot of what she had experienced was, like, the white women that she was interviewing saying that, like, oh, well, like, I'm not as bad as white men. So, like, you can see how these trends are, like, kind of, like, pretty similar. Another one of my friends had done a project on biracial masculinity, and a lot of times the focus was on saying that, like, their masculinity couldn't be problematic because of their race. So what I was trying to get at was just, like, a more, like, intersectional way of thinking about things, and also understanding that, like, there's a lot of good that can be done if this is something that, like, white men, like, begin to think about, and, like, for, like, any white people in the room to be thinking about as well, like, how, like, white people can hold other white people accountable, and then for men in the room as well, like, holding other people accountable for, like, their masculinity and the way in which they're perceived. Because I think a lot of the times, like, it is very true that, like, the burden of call-out culture falls to either women or people of color, like, based on the comment that is made. And you can make the same thing about, like, any other, like, marginalized identity. But just, like, recognizing the ways in which your power and your privilege exist, teaching yourself about it, trying to learn about it, like, seeking out opportunities like that, but then, like, also, like, taking that knowledge beyond, like, rather than just thinking, and, like, I know I'm so guilty of this, like, rather than just being like, yeah, I'm liberal, that's enough, like, I understand that, like, racism and sexism exist, and, like, not everyone else does, but, like, finding real ways to, like, trying to end that, especially recognizing that, like, we as, like, Villanovans, like, are already sitting on this, like, position of power in society, like, we're going to be, like, we're already partially college educated, like, we're going to have a degree, like, we're going to be existing in, like, pretty higher up spaces in society, like, if you look relatively. So the ways in which like we can like take that knowledge further, rather than just like graduating and like leaving behind like any kind of experience of like learning about social justice.